The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, stamped with the Harborview HOA seal and dripping with legal threats. Daniel Torres, 52, a maritime lawyer who'd inherited his grandfather's waterfront cottage 3 years ago, read the demand twice before his hands started shaking, not from fear, but from barely contained fury. The letter claimed his private dock was community property and demanded he remove his sailboat within 72 hours or face a $500 daily fine. This wasn't the first time HOA President Linda Prescott had tried to claim what wasn't hers. For 6 months, she'd been spreading lies at board meetings, filing bogus complaints, and telling new residents that his grandfather's 80-year-old dock belonged to the HOA. But this letter crossed a line Daniel had been waiting for her to cross. Because what Linda didn't know, what she hadn't bothered to research before putting her threats in writing, was that Daniel's property deed didn't just own the dock. It owned the entire harbor entrance. And today, the lawyer she'd been poking finally decided to respond. Before we see how a maritime lawyer schooled an entitled HOA president in property law, if you enjoy stories where entitled people discover they've picked the wrong fight with the wrong person, smash that like button and subscribe. Trust me, you'll want to see how this unfolds. This is a story in 3 parts. The violation that pushed a patient man past his breaking point, the confrontation where decades of legal expertise met 6 months of entitled ignorance, and the resolution where one threatening letter destroyed an HOA president's entire power structure. For half a year, Daniel had watched Linda Prescott systematically lie about his property rights, knowing that patience and documentation would serve him better than immediate conflict. He'd endured her spreading rumors to neighbors, her attempts to physically block his dock access, her complaints to the county that wasted his time with inspections that always vindicated him. He'd watched her convince herself that his quiet professionalism meant weakness, that his reluctance to engage meant he had something to hide. What she never considered was that maritime lawyers don't just know property law. They know waterway rights, historical deeds, and exactly how much leverage a single document can provide. The confrontation came not in a screaming match, but in a conference room where Linda's smugness evaporated as Daniel calmly explained what his property deed actually said. The moment she understood that her threatening letter had given him everything he needed to not just defend his dock, but to control her access to the water entirely, her face went from confident red to terrified white in seconds. Because Daniel hadn't just been enduring her attacks, he'd been waiting for her to commit them to writing. The resolution brought consequences that rippled through the entire HOA, exposing years of Linda's overreach and transforming the power dynamic of the community forever. What started as her attempt to steal a dock ended with her losing something far more valuable than property. And the historical document Daniel finally revealed didn't just prove ownership. It proved that the harbor entrance Linda used to launch her boat every weekend existed at his discretion. Here's exactly how it happened. Daniel Torres had never wanted to be the guy fighting his HOA. When he'd inherited his grandfather's cottage on Harborview Lane at 49, still grieving the man who'd taught him to sail in these same waters, the last thing on his mind was property disputes. Daniel worked 60-hour weeks at a Boston maritime law firm, specializing in coastal access rights and waterway regulations, complex cases involving shipping companies, marina developments, and historical property boundaries. The cottage was supposed to be his sanctuary, the place where he could disconnect from legal battles and remember why he'd fallen in love with the water in the first place. His grandfather, Captain Miguel Torres, had built the dock in 1943 with his own hands, and Daniel had spent every childhood summer fishing off those weathered planks. The cottage was small, just 2 bedrooms, but it sat on a prime piece of waterfront with deep water access that made it perfect for his 30-foot sailboat, the Elena, named after his late grandmother. The trouble started 4 months after Daniel moved in permanently, taking remote work to escape the city grind. Linda Prescott, 58, the Harborview HOA president who'd held the position for 12 years through what neighbors quietly called aggressive volunteer intimidation, appeared at his dock one Saturday morning in May. Daniel was cleaning the Elena's hull when Linda's shadow fell across the deck, her arms crossed, her expression radiating the particular smugness of someone convinced they held all the power. She informed him, without introduction or pleasantries, that the community dock needed to remain accessible for all residents and that his boat was monopolizing shared resources. Daniel had looked up from his work, confused, and explained politely that this was his private dock, built by his grandfather, maintained at his expense, and clearly within his property boundaries. Linda's response was a condescending smile and a warning that she'd be looking into the situation. Daniel had returned to his cleaning, assuming that would be the end of it. A simple property survey would prove ownership. He didn't realize that Linda Prescott had no intention of letting facts interfere with what she wanted. The second incident came 3 weeks later, escalating from annoying to genuinely problematic. Daniel came home from a grocery run to find Linda hosting what she called a community meeting on his dock. 8 residents sitting in folding chairs she'd brought, discussing shared waterfront maintenance responsibilities. She'd walked onto his private property, set up furniture, and was actively telling neighbors that the dock had always been community property, and that Daniel's grandfather had merely been the caretaker. When Daniel interrupted, presenting his property deed and pointing out the clear boundary markers, Linda dismissed the document with a wave, claiming it was outdated, and that community use over decades establishes shared ownership. The residents looked uncomfortable, several apologizing as they left, but Linda remained, insisting she had every right to be here. Daniel had called the non-emergency police line, and the responding officer had confirmed Daniel's ownership and asked Linda to leave. She'd complied, but not before loudly declaring that this wasn't over and that the HOA had legal resources to challenge his selfish monopolization of waterfront access. The breaking point came on a humid August evening when Daniel returned from a week-long work trip to Boston. His sailboat was gone. The Alina, his $45,000 vessel and the last tangible connection to afternoons spent sailing with his grandfather, had been moved from his dock to the public marina 2 miles down the coast. A note zip-tied to his dock cleat, written in Linda's distinctive purple ink, explained that the boat had been relocated to appropriate community storage, and that he could retrieve it at his own expense after paying a $200 unauthorized mooring fine to the HOA. Daniel stood there as the sun set, his hands trembling with a rage so profound it took him 20 minutes to trust himself to make a phone call. This wasn't just theft, it was the destruction of something sacred, touched by someone who had no concept of what she'd actually done. He spent that night filing a police report for theft, documenting everything with photographs and timestamps, and then doing something he'd been avoiding. He opened the locked drawer in his grandfather's desk and pulled out the original 1943 property deed, the one his grandfather had told him to keep safe, because someday someone might need reminding about who really owns what around here. Daniel had tried reasoning with Linda. He'd tried showing her modern surveys. He'd tried involving authorities. Every attempt had been met with dismissal, mockery, or escalation. The police had helped him retrieve his boat, but they'd also told him that civil property disputes weren't really their jurisdiction and suggested he work it out with the HOA. Linda had used that phrase at the next HOA meeting, telling residents that even the police agree this is a civil matter, and that she was pursuing legal channels to establish proper community access. Daniel had sat in that meeting, silent, watching her rewrite reality, watching neighbors who'd once been friendly now avoid eye contact, wondering if maybe this lawyer who'd been too nice was actually hiding something. He'd gone home that night and made a decision. If Linda wanted legal channels, he'd give her legal channels, but he wouldn't be the one initiating. He'd wait for her to put her threats in writing, to commit to a course of action that would give him not just defensive grounds, but leverage. Because Daniel Torres hadn't spent 25 years studying maritime property law without learning that the best legal victories come when your opponent hands you the weapon. And on that Tuesday morning in October, when the certified letter arrived demanding he remove his boat and threatening daily fines, Linda Prescott finally gave him exactly what he'd been waiting for. Daniel read the letter one more time, then smiled for the first time in months, picked up his phone, and scheduled an emergency HOA board meeting. It was time to teach an entitled bully what legal channels actually looked like when wielded by someone who knew how to use them. The emergency board meeting convened at 7 p.m. on Thursday in the Harborview Community Center, a cramped room that smelled of coffee and old carpet. Linda sat at the head of the table, flanked by her two board allies, Treasurer Margaret Chen and Secretary Robert Keller, both of whom had learned that agreeing with Linda was easier than opposing her. 4 other residents attended, curious about the meeting's sudden calling. Daniel arrived exactly on time, carrying a leather folder, his expression calm and professional. Linda's opening smile was triumphant, clearly expecting Daniel to plead his case while she magnanimously offered him terms for limited dock access. She was already speaking, something about finally addressing the dock situation properly, when Daniel interrupted with a quiet but firm voice that made everyone in the room instinctively stop talking. Linda, before you continue, I need to inform you that this meeting is being recorded for legal purposes, and I've invited County Clerk Michael Stevens to join us via conference call to verify some historical documents. Michael, are you there? Daniel placed his phone on speaker as a professional voice confirmed attendance. Linda's smile faltered, confusion crossing her features as Daniel opened his leather folder and removed 3 documents, sliding copies across the table to each board member. What you're looking at is the original 1943 property deed for 47 Harborview Lane, signed by the town clerk and registered with the county. This is the 1987 property survey conducted when my grandfather added the cottage extension. And this is the 2022 boundary verification I commissioned when I inherited the property. All 3 confirm the same thing. My dock, the one you've been calling community property for 6 months, sits entirely within my private property boundaries. Linda barely glanced at the documents, her voice sharp. I've seen property deeds before, Mr. Torres. What you're showing us doesn't change decades of community use. And Daniel's next words cut through her objection like a blade through water. Linda Marie Prescott, 58, residing at 93 Harborview Lane, HOA president since 2011, currently operating under the mistaken belief that 12 years of holding a volunteer position grants you authority over private property rights. Before you continue making false claims that I'm now documenting in this recorded meeting, I need you to understand something about the deed you haven't actually bothered to read. The room went silent. Linda's face flushed red, but Daniel continued, his lawyer voice emerging, calm, factual, devastating. Margaret Chen, Treasurer, 61, 107 Harborview Lane. Robert Keller, Secretary, 5582 Harborview Lane. I'm addressing you both specifically because Linda's actions over the past 6 months, culminating in her threatening letter sent via certified mail on Tuesday, have exposed this HOA to significant legal liability. I want you to understand exactly what she's done before I explain what happens next. Margaret and Robert exchanged nervous glances, suddenly very interested in the documents in front of them. Daniel flipped to a specific page in the original 1943 deed, a section highlighted in yellow. My grandfather, Captain Miguel Torres, didn't just buy waterfront property in 1943. He purchased what was then classified as commercial maritime property, specifically the deepwater mooring rights and harbor entrance access for what was originally planned as a small fishing cooperative. The town was developing this area for commercial use, and my grandfather, who ran a fishing charter business, bought the primary access point. When the town later rezoned for residential development in 1968, my grandfather's commercial property rights were grandfathered in. What that means, Linda, is that this deed doesn't just give me ownership of my dock. It gives me controlling rights over the harbor entrance channel, the same channel that every single boat in this community uses to access open water. The implications hung in the air like a thunderclap. Linda's face had gone from red to pale, her mouth opening and closing without sound. Daniel wasn't finished. County Clerk Stevens, can you confirm for everyone present that the 1943 Torres deed includes language granting, perpetual access and mooring rights to the tidal channel extending from the property boundary to navigable waters, with authority to regulate channel usage in accordance with maritime safety standards? The voice on the phone confirmed, reading the exact legal language from the county's digital archives. Daniel watched comprehension dawn on Linda's face, the slow, horrifying realization that she hadn't been fighting over a dock. She'd been threatening the man who technically owned the legal right to control whether her boat could leave the harbor. Now, Linda, let's discuss your certified letter. The one where you threatened me with $500 daily fines. The one where you claimed my private property as HOA jurisdiction. The one that your lawyer, had you bothered to consult one before sending legal threats to an actual maritime attorney, would have told you constitutes harassment, attempted theft of property rights, and opens you personally, not the HOA, but you personally, to civil liability. Daniel's voice never rose, but his words landed with surgical precision. I've spent 6 months documenting every false claim you've made, every time you've trespassed on my property, every lie you've told neighbors about ownership. I have security footage of you moving my boat without permission, which the police have confirmed meets the threshold for theft. I have recordings of HOA meetings where you've defamed me based on property claims you knew or should have known were false. And now I have your threatening letter, sent via certified mail, giving me written proof of intentional harassment. Linda finally found her voice, but it came out weak and defensive. You can't just... You wouldn't actually stop people from using the harbor. That's insane. Everyone here would sue you. Daniel's expression didn't change. You're right, I wouldn't, because unlike you, I'm not interested in abusing power I happen to hold. But here's what's going to happen, and I need you to listen very carefully because this is the only offer you're getting. Daniel laid out his terms with the precision of someone who'd prepared this moment for months. Linda would resign as HOA president immediately, effective tonight, with a written statement admitting she'd been mistaken about property boundaries and apologizing for her conduct. She would pay $3,000 to cover Daniel's legal documentation costs, his boat retrieval expenses, and compensation for the harassment campaign. She would sign a legally binding agreement never to make claims about his property again, with $10,000 penalties for any future violations. In exchange, Daniel would not pursue theft charges for moving his boat, would not file a civil harassment lawsuit, and would not exercise his legal right to regulate the harbor channel access. A right he'd be happy to let sit dormant as long as no one else decided to threaten him with fake authority over his private property. Or, Daniel said quietly, I can spend the next 6 months doing to you exactly what you've spent 6 months trying to do to me, except my claims will be backed by actual legal documents, actual property rights, and actual consequences. I can file formal complaints with the county about every instance of HOA overreach I've documented. I can pursue criminal theft charges. I can sue you personally for harassment, defamation, and property interference. And yes, I can post notice at the harbor entrance requiring permits for channel usage, which I'm legally entitled to do, and make every single boat owner in this community aware that their access exists because I choose not to enforce rights I actually possess. Your choice, Linda. Make this right quietly, or I make it right loudly. Margaret Chen's voice broke the silence that followed. Linda, I think you should take his offer. Robert Keller nodded vigorously. Linda looked at the documents, at Daniel's calm expression, at the county clerk still waiting on speaker phone. Her hands trembled as she reached for a pen. 20 minutes later, she'd signed everything, her signature shaky, her face stained with tears of humiliation and rage. As the board members filed out, avoiding eye contact with their former president, Daniel gathered his documents carefully. Linda remained seated, staring at the table. Before leaving, Daniel paused at the door. Linda, the difference between you and me? I actually know what I own. Maybe next time, research before you threaten. The door closed quietly behind him, leaving the former HOA president alone with the wreckage of her overconfidence. The $3,000 check arrived via certified mail exactly 48 hours later, accompanied by Linda's resignation letter to the HOA board and a typed apology that Daniel suspected her lawyer had written. The apology was stiff and formal, claiming misunderstandings about property boundaries and regret for any inconvenience caused, but it was signed and legally binding. Daniel deposited the check, filed the documents with his attorney, and thought that would be the end of it. A quiet resolution where he defended his property, and Linda had learned an expensive lesson about threatening people whose expertise she'd completely underestimated. But communities talk, especially small waterfront communities where everyone knows everyone's business, and what Linda had hoped to keep quiet spread through Harborview like a summer storm. It started with Margaret Chen, the former treasurer, who'd apparently been waiting years for someone to finally stand up to Linda's bullying tactics. At the next HOA meeting, with Linda conspicuously absent, Margaret addressed the 30 residents in attendance and calmly explained what had happened, not to humiliate Linda further, but to ensure the community understood the actual property boundaries and legal realities that governed their neighborhood. Margaret revealed that she'd quietly been documenting Linda's overreach for years. The unauthorized beautification fines that had no basis in HOA bylaws, the arbitrary rule changes Linda had implemented without proper board votes, the maintenance fees that had mysteriously increased while actual maintenance visibly declined. Daniel attended that meeting at Margaret's request, bringing copies of the historical property documents and explaining, in patient detail, the complicated history of maritime property rights in their area. He made clear that he had no intention of ever restricting harbor access, and that his grandfather's commercial rights existed only as a legal protection against exactly what Linda had tried to do. But two other property owners approached him afterward with their own stories. Carol Hendricks, 67, who Linda had fined $800 for unauthorized fence height, despite the fence meeting all county codes, and James Wu, 42, whose shed removal Linda had demanded based on setback rules that James's architect had proven didn't apply. Both had paid rather than fight. Both now wanted to know if Daniel's property research had revealed anything about their situations. Daniel spent the next weekend doing something he'd never planned to do, conducting a comprehensive property rights review for the entire Harborview development. What he found was damning. Linda had spent years leveraging her HOA position to make up rules, threaten property owners with fake violations, and collect money for fines that had no legal basis. The HOA bylaws, which Daniel obtained from the county, explicitly limited the board's authority to maintenance of common areas and enforcement of basic community standards. Linda had been operating far beyond those boundaries, and the money she'd collected had gone into an HOA reserve fund that seemed to have funded everything from her personal boat repairs to the expensive outdoor furniture on her deck. Daniel documented everything, then brought it to Margaret and Robert, along with a recommendation that they hire a forensic accountant and consider formal complaints to the county. The confrontation Daniel hadn't wanted came 3 weeks later when Linda showed up at his dock on a Saturday afternoon, her face lined with exhaustion and something that might have been genuine remorse. Daniel was working on the Alina's rigging when she appeared, standing at the dock entrance, not crossing onto his property. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Linda's voice came out quiet and defeated. "You destroyed me. Everyone knows what I did. My neighbors won't talk to me. The county's investigating the HOA finances. I'm probably going to lose my house paying back the fines I collected." Daniel set down his tools and looked at her directly. "Linda, I didn't destroy you. I defended my property, everything else. The financial investigation, the community turning against you, that happened because you spent years abusing power you didn't actually have. You didn't just come after me. I was just the one who finally had the expertise and resources to prove you wrong." What? Linda's response was bitter. "You could have just talked to me privately, shown me the deed. We could have resolved this without humiliating me in front of everyone." Daniel felt anger rise in his chest and worked to keep his voice level. "I tried talking to you multiple times. You dismissed every document I showed you, called me selfish, filed false complaints, and moved my boat. My grandmother's namesake, the last thing I have of my grandfather, like it was garbage. You didn't want resolution, Linda. You wanted submission. And when I wouldn't submit, you sent me legal threats. So yes, when you finally pushed me far enough, I responded with the full weight of actual legal authority. Not fake HOA power, not threats and intimidation. Real property law that you should have researched before you decided to bully a maritime attorney." The final reckoning came from an unexpected source. One of the newer Harborview residents, Emma Tran, 38, a commercial real estate developer who'd been quietly watching the situation unfold, approached Daniel with a proposal. She'd reviewed the HOA bylaws, talked to multiple residents, and wanted to completely restructure the organization with proper legal oversight, transparent finances, and clearly defined authority limits. She asked if Daniel would serve on the new board as a legal advisor. Not president, not treasurer, just someone who could ensure the HOA actually operated within its proper boundaries. Daniel initially declined, wanting nothing to do with HOA politics. But Emma's follow-up convinced him. Right now, everyone's terrified because they just learned their HOA president was basically running a protection racket. They need to see that property rights can be defended without abuse. They need someone who actually knows what legal authority looks like. 2 months after the confrontation, Daniel found himself sitting in the community center again, this time as part of a newly elected board that included Emma as president, Margaret as treasurer, and 3 other residents committed to transparency. The first order of business was returning $12,000 in collected fines that the forensic audit had determined were improperly charged. The second was implementing a policy requiring legal review of any fine or rule change. The third was establishing a community fund to help residents like Carol and James get independent legal advice if they ever felt the HOA was overreaching. Linda Prescott didn't attend any meetings. Word around the neighborhood was that she'd listed her house for sale and would be moving to Florida to live near her sister. Some residents felt sorry for her. Others felt justice had been served. Daniel felt mostly tired. On a cool December morning, Daniel sat on his grandfather's dock, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over calm water. The Alina rocked gently at her mooring, exactly where she belonged. The dock's old wood creaked familiarly under his weight, the same sound he'd heard every childhood summer. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma, something about reviewing proposed landscaping guidelines before the next meeting. He'd respond later. Right now, he just wanted to sit here in the peace his grandfather had built 80 years ago. The peace Linda Prescott had tried to steal. The peace he'd fought to protect not through aggression, but through knowledge, patience, and the simple truth of documents that proved what actually belonged to him. Daniel had learned something profound through this entire ordeal. Justice doesn't always come from fighting back immediately when someone wrongs you. Sometimes it comes from understanding your actual rights, documenting everything, and waiting for your antagonist to commit themselves so thoroughly to their false narrative that the truth, when finally revealed, carries devastating weight. He'd never wanted to be the guy threatening harbor access or filing lawsuits or destroying an HOA president's reputation. But he'd also learned that defending what's yours, really defending it, with evidence and expertise and unwavering knowledge of where your property boundaries lie, sometimes requires being willing to use every advantage you possess. Linda had gambled that his patience meant weakness. She'd learned expensively that patience can be strategy. And as Daniel sat there in the morning light, his grandfather's dock solid beneath him, his grandmother's namesake floating peacefully at mooring, he smiled. Because justice, whether it comes fast or slow, hits exactly as hard as it needs to when backed by 80 years of property rights, and a deed that proved some things don't belong to the person who wants them most, but to the person who actually owns them. 300 miles south in Charleston, South Carolina, retired Navy engineer Patricia Cole was trimming her roses when her neighbor demanded she remove the unsightly solar panels from her roof, panels that powered not just her home, but the entire street during last year's hurricane blackout. Patricia smiled, the same smile that once preceded high-level Pentagon briefings, and pulled out the city's alternative energy incentive program documentation she'd personally helped draft as a civilian infrastructure consultant. "Please," she said quietly, "tell me more about which building codes you think I'm violating." Her neighbor went pale, but that's a story for another time.